Hello, everyone. While we wait for, there it is, while we wait for the slides to show up, thanks for the warm introduction. Thanks for having me here and the invitation. I'm very happy as I got probably the best setup for my talk from the two previous talks, because we're going to see some, or at least similar slides that were shown before in my setup as well. Just to give sort of this ease into my presentation, we are from Boehringer Ingelheim, the largest German pharmaceutical company who's looking into quantum computing as a way of sort of leveraging drug design in the future. There's a team of 5 of us inside the company who do a wide range of projects, ranging from the one we will see in a second, sort of sketching out how large of a machine one would need when sort of tackling industry-relevant problems that we have inside our company, and then also going further, sort of developing the algorithms to take it a step further and sort of show scientists or other scientists where our needs lie, what kind of projects would be interesting to us, and sort of what information to extract from these kind of calculations. To kick us off, what's the main problem a pharmaceutical company has? And it's sort of, I would argue, it's this one right here. It's drug design, as this sketch here shows. So how all these processes start is by having something that's called a target, which is the grayed out large part in the background of this slide here, which is usually some molecular pocket associated with some disease. Sometimes it's inside your body, sometimes it sits on a parasite or a virus, and so on and so forth. And your quote-unquote only task is to find a molecule that fits inside this pocket and binds to this inhibitor and doesn't kill you in the process. Sounds easy enough. Turns out very hard problem, and sort of every little bit helps in sort of finding the right molecule for each target. And usually all of these drugs that we see here, or that are sold in the world today, are like these small organic molecule drugs. So they're out of tens of atoms. You usually don't have super interesting atoms around it, a couple of hydrogens, a couple of oxygens, some carbons. Yes, so modeling these processes is one of the things you will see in a second. Also motivation to find new ways of designing drugs is that the cost of developing new drugs has exploded over the last decades, even when it's adjusted for inflation, as this chart is. Yeah, there is a need to bring more cost-effective ways of finding new drugs to the market, and quantum computing is proposed as one of these to sort of alleviate, bring this current curve down up a bit at the far end. The molecule we see here, also not too big, but it's sort of the main drug we have. It is called Jardiance, and what it does, it opens a pathway in your kidney. So when you have diabetes, blood sugar spikes, the blood sugar spikes that usually are the ones that damage your organs, sort of can flow over your kidney and don't do too much damage when they occur in the body. This is a SketchUp of how sort of this whole pipeline works out to be. That's very costly. Usually it's very long, takes about 10 years, and nowadays about 2 billion sort of from start to finish. And you really start by sort of finding the target you're interested in, and then starting off by this 10 to the 60 large chemical space of possible molecules that are sort of available today, to really then narrow it down step by step by step, to then find a handful of molecules you can then send into clinical trials. And in doing so, you sort of try to leverage every technology that's available for you: chemistry, biology, and material sciences. Everything that you can use will be used in sort of trying to find the right molecule. And when looking at this from a different angle, sort of how sort of this flows up until the clinical trials, is you start by imaging some tissues to get a feel for how the disease interacts. Then chemistry happens, which we will see in a second, where we are concerned with molecular dynamics. So how does the potential drug bind to this target? Does it float away? We don't know. And then how strong does it bind in terms of like the binding affinity prediction here? And then on the further end, we go into like understanding how drugs pass through the body, so how they're adhered, pass through, and then at some point get excreted as well. And then at the very end, that's also not the least of the concern, is are there any major side effects or could we predict side effects when looking at these drugs? And when we started out, so the group exists since COVID and since 2020, we focused on looking at chemistry as it seemed the most, let's say, natural way of fitting quantum computing into this pipeline, as there were sort of clear use cases there where there were some guarantees where one could say, okay, here, quantum computing has the edge over classical computers. So this is where we're going to zoom in now in a second and see how one could replace some of the classical pipelines there as well. You've seen this slide in Peter's talk in a way. This is sort of just looking at it from a molecular perspective. So when you're interested in finding or modeling these systems on a computer, you are sort of working in these different length scale. You can see here from left to right. So you go lower in space because you sort of go higher in accuracy, and as you need higher and higher accuracy for your needs, the less and less molecules you're able to treat in your system. So at the very far end, when you want to have the exact solution to your problem, you're only allowed to treat a handful of atoms. And then sort of at the top, you go to coupled cluster, which is usually referred to as like the gold standard in chemistry, but it also sort of only allows you to expand the space of, or like the number of atoms you can treat by a bit. Then there's DFT, which is, I think, one of the major workhorses, especially in the pharmaceutical industry, where you're then sort of allowed to even treat a bigger system. And then there's these empirical methods at the very far end, which are computationally very cheap, but also very crude, but sometimes that's good enough, where you can really model large chunks of your molecular system and sort of in solution as well, where there's water floating around it. As quantum computers are going to be slow in a way, because sort of their clock cycles currently, as predicted, is like 1,000 times slower than current classical compute, so we're like megahertz versus gigahertz. So I think the competition here is more on the right side, where we can say, okay, maybe we can get a higher accurate method, but sort of time is working in your favor. But this is sort of, if you're looking to replace some of your computational needs in quantum chemistry, you're probably more looking at the right side here. So now talking numbers. When we started out of like estimating, okay, is there any interesting systems around, which systems we're going to need? The first thing we then found after some looking with Google was the cytochrome P450, which is a heme protein in your liver, and it's sort of the way in way drugs get metabolized inside your body. So when you are like reading the package description on your drug and it says don't eat grapefruit, it's because of this guy right here, because it sort of binds to the same receptor and sort of the interactions. You don't want to have something that's metabolized at the same time. It's not really a target per se, but sort of the interaction with the one thing that metabolizes is still very interesting for us. So it's one of the systems that one would be interested in modeling, for example. It contains iron, which makes sort of its electronic structure pretty difficult, which makes it a good target for quantum computing, as classical methods usually struggle to nail the chemistry of the system here. And then back in 2022, Google and us went out and looked at the sort of the current best estimates of modeling this in a fault-tolerant manner, as Cecile explained, sort of how large would a system be to host a calculation, and what is the edge of what was currently classically available. So we looked at, okay, where does classic compute scale out, and then take a problem of this size and want to host it on one of the quantum boxes. And back in the day, with sort of Google's hardware, you needed around 4 million physical qubits, which then related to like over 1,000 logical qubits, and had a runtime of 3 days, which is too slow for, let's say, competitive modeling at the time. But it was sort of the first stick in the ground of actually having a number associated with how expensive these calculations could get for problems of industrially relevant sizes and sort of beyond. So where's the crossover point between classical and quantum compute? But as I mentioned, this is still pretty long, And the main issue why this is pretty long is because sort of the ground state energy calculation that this sort of constitutes is not an application per se. So usually on the classical side, this one calculation happens millions of times to then be able to do dynamics and sort of model how things do these two systems bind or not. You have to compute thermodynamical properties, which is much more expensive, and this is just a routine being used in these calculations. So 3 days is not cutting it, but it was sort of the best estimate at the time. So what we then did, part of our work was to then sort of take this first estimate and optimize it, because we knew, okay, there's different knobs you can turn. And one of the main knobs you can turn is using a classical compute again. And the problem is modeled by this Hamiltonian, which is essentially just a large matrix. And then the task becomes of massaging this matrix into another one that hopefully, or like if you do it carefully, still encodes the same problem you had before, but at a lower cost to your quantum computer. And there's sort of different games you can play, and then there's something you can do that's called THC, or double factorization, where you sort of use your tricks in linear algebra and find a matrix that still encodes the same problem. You can then extract some symmetries as well to decrease what's referred to as the one norm of this thing, as so this is related to the cost of your quantum algorithm, to make it as small as possible, to condense the problem size you're looking at. And then on the other side, what you also can do is find smarter ways of compiling these algorithms, which is sort of what is called as active volume, which is a technique PsiQuantum developed. This is work with PsiQuantum. I think we've seen their name on the slide before as well, where because they're this photonic architecture and they have let's say it's easy for them to make more connections between their individual elements, so it's easier to route another fiber optic cable to another box than, for example, make another connection on a chip. So by exploiting that their systems is interconnected more heavily than others, they can sort of structure their problems in nicer ways. And as you can see, this is quantum addition as a circuit, which usually would scale quadratically because it sort of has to go back and forth. And in their way of compiling this algorithm, this scales more like linear, which is a huge saving. And then you can put these two techniques together and find another speed up of 108, sort of in terms of runtime of these systems, and get the speed down to 14 hours or 1 hour, depending on how large of a factor you want to build. I think we've seen the size of the system they want to build, and I think it's right between sort of the two that are shown here. So yeah, you still need a large system to host these calculations, but at least in terms of runtime, we have another factor of 108 in 3 years now. Still too long, but the direction is where we want to go. So as we continue to shave off more and more orders of magnitude from the runtime of these calculations, this becomes more and more feasible for at some point to be competitive against current classical compute. But as you might all know, because we're on an HPC conference, classical compute today is very hard to beat. We spend a lot of time developing these techniques and building the hardware. So it will, and it's also not it's a moving target as well. So it's not clear to us when things might catch up, when the switch might happen at some point. There's other questions that are relevant. P450 is an interesting molecule and it has a hard electronic structure. Are there enough of these cases around that justify using a quantum computer? Because classical compute usually works very well for these kind of small systems that we have here. So is there even a need to go more accurate than we already currently have? Maybe a different question that one could ask is, if we not in this system where we want to know the exact answer, or at least a very good approximation to the exact answer, is there good ways of approximating methods that then scale faster and become more competitive? Yes. And then I think the more looming question is, once you move beyond these ground state energy calculations, how can you extract more than that, than, for example, forces to dynamics, excited states, or even thermodynamic properties? I think there it's not quite clear how things will look like in the fault-tolerant era. We've sketched out some sort of way of doing more in a quantum box, where you don't have to read out the forces, which is very expensive, but this is beyond the scope of this talk. But there's still work to be done, just on the algorithmic side, to really bring this promised application of drug discovery into the realm of quantum computers. And with that, thank you. I think questions will be at the end. Yes, so if there is any questions you have, also after the talk, it would be very interesting to talk if you have ideas of like solving these problems that are still between us and the application of these things. And with that, thank you.